Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It is Father Craig Friday. Father Craig is here. Welcome, Father Craig.
I feel very welcome. Thanks for having me, Brianne.
I'm excited because Father Craig just told me that he used to be able to do the splits both ways.
That's back when I used to be in martial arts and a lot less heavy and much more in shape.
I don't think I've ever been so impressed with such a statement. I'm just so impressed at that. I'm like, I cannot believe this.
That's funny.
Anyways, I'm very impressed. So, welcome everyone. This is our podcast on Fridays. We have you guys submit your questions, and then we have a Catholic priest answer them. So it's pretty awesome. If you ever have a question, you are welcome to submit yours. The first question is, okay, if you had to pick, you could only have one. Would you rather have perfect hair or perfect teeth? One or the other.
Like, how bad is the other?
So,
I have no teeth, or I'm bald?
Yeah, so receding hairline with perfect teeth.
Okay.
Or really janky teeth that are crooked and all weird looking, but great hair. Maybe even a mullet.
It's tough because I have great hair and great teeth.
I know.
Yeah,
and so now you have to get rid of one. Which one are you getting rid of?
Oh, I like my teeth.
Okay.
I like having teeth that... I'd much rather have, because teeth, it can be painful. Hair loss is just like your ego. Yeah. I'd rather be humbled with the loss of my hair.
Hair loss is ego loss.
Yes, hair loss is ego loss, and I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I probably need it.
I think,
What about you?
I don't know. Because
I don't think this is a girl question.
Well,
you guys don't lose your hair very much.
I don't like my hair to begin with because it's curly, so it does crazy things, and having curly hair does crazy things.
Okay.
So I might go with the teeth.
Yeah, I'm not...
Because I already don't like my hair anyways, so it's whatever. I've already let that go.
So you would rather have a receding hairline as a woman?
Dude, I would be bald. Oh. If my hair started to... my hairline recedes, I'm just shaving my head.
Brian, bless you.
Brian's listening. He's like, oh no.
Yeah, bless you, Brian.
All right, everyone. So
this might be a prophecy, a foretelling of something yet to come.
Things to come. Yeah, I think it'd be cool. I would just get a bunch of cool hats. That'd be cool.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. Hats. Yeah, hats.
So trade-off. You can't do anything
what
with your
Father
teeth.
Jonathan does.
Yeah, he does.
He does hats.
He rocks the...
the little...
I don't even know what that's called.
Golf cap? I don't know what this is.
I don't know. He looks good in it, though.
Yeah.
Shout out to Father Jonathan. Okay, so our very first question here comes from a listener who wants to know, why are verses different in different Bibles? Are Bible translations always correct?
What a great question. I really like that question. So sometimes we think that the Bible was just given to us in English, or sometimes even as Catholics we might think that it was given to us in Latin. Neither of those things are true. So the Bible, it was written over an extended period of time, a significant period of time. Especially when you look at the Old Testament, you know that it's thousands of years of oral history, probably written down and edited and redacted by various authors and people over different groupings of time. And typically, it was the language that during the time period where it was written that was used. So a lot of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And then even portions of it were written maybe in Greek or Aramaic. Well, I should say there was there's too much history here, but the idea is that generally it was written in the language during the time period which the time was written, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. And at the time of Jesus, the New Testament was mostly written in Greek, even though they would have spoken probably Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Well, I guess Hebrew is more of a written Aramaic. Anyway, it doesn't... It just was not written in English and in Latin, essentially. And so what we have is and also here's the other thing is you didn't have a compiled codex of the Bible. What you had is different scrolls of the different books, but they weren't all compiled together typically. You'd have different scrolls that would have the different books of the Bible. And it wasn't compiled into codex until, maybe the time of Jerome, maybe 300 years after Christ's, resurrection from the dead. And so I think it's around that time period. I might be a little off there. But it wasn't all compiled together. So what you have today in a book that has all of the, I guess it's 73 books of the Bible. Am I forgetting the Deuterocanonical? There might be a few more. Yeah, I think 73 includes the Deuterocanonical. But if you have all those books in there, they're compiled together in your book, what you're doing is you're taking all these different fragments of these different existing texts that are out there that scholars have sort of looked at and compiled and translating them from Greek into the language of the day, or from Hebrew into the language of the day. And so there's different ways to translate a language. So if you speak two languages, I know you speak some Spanish, I speak some Spanish, and we both speak English. Like if you're translating from English into Spanish and we try to say something that's similar, we might say it a different way, and it would still be correct translation. And so the same thing is true of translating something from its original language into English today. So you're going to find some variation in the types of translations that are out there. And you can also translate it with a certain intention of making it easier for people to understand. So there might be a bit of paraphrasing in a translation, depending on the approach. And then there can also be more literal. But one of the challenges of translating languages, especially things like idioms, phrases, I think, what is it in the Old Testament? To be wise might be, I think it's the phrase to be long of nose or something like that.
Wow.
And we would hear long of nose if we did a literal translation. We have no idea what that means. But if you said that they were wiser, you'd go, oh, I know what that means. And so sometimes a translator might take the phrase, it's an idiom, and translate into what it means in plain English. And so there's different types of translations that exist. And so that is something that's causes variation sometimes in the translations of the verses. It is possible for people to make a mistake. Translators do make mistakes, but typically the editions of the Bible that we have now are so heavily vetted with so many different scholars looking at them that you're not going to really have a mistake so much as you're going to have probably a very intentional way of translating something. But they do exist sometimes. You'll find errors, and I'm not enough of a scholar to know when that is. And so what I do is I just read 3 different translations, and that's really kind of more helpful. You might take a few different translations.
Yeah, that's one thing that I find to be very helpful is sometimes I'll pull up a verse online and I'll look at the different, because there's Catholic Bibles, right? So I'll look at the different Catholic translations and to see that variation, and then I get a more accurate idea of like, oh, okay, this is what they're saying because I saw it kind of phrased differently. And I think that that's helpful sometimes. That way it's not just looking at one translation. So
yeah, and this is something to be a little bit wary of, I think, as Catholics, is that there's not only language translation things and cultural translation things, but there's also theology translation things. And so if you have a certain view of Scripture, and when you're interpreting it from Greek to English, and you want it to mean a certain thing, you might translate it in such a way that it looks more like what you think it ought to mean, because there is sort of this issue of the translator themselves. And so, some of the translations from Protestantism might interpret things with a language that supports sort of a Protestant theology. And, of course, Catholics are going to interpret it in such a way that supports a Catholic theology. And so if you really do believe, as we do, that the Church has the fullness of truth, you're going to probably want a Catholic Bible. It also includes 7 books of the Old Testament that Protestant Bibles typically take out, or they label the Apocrypha. We call that the Deuterocanonical. We believe they're inspired books. The Protestants do not believe those are inspired books. And so you'd want a Catholic translation.
Yeah. So either way, no matter what translation you go with, just
I would recommend the
Bible.
Ignatius Study Bible is a great one.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, that's a good one. Awesome. All right. So our next question, this person wants to know, if an item like a scapula has been blessed and it accidentally gets washed. I know, scapular. Look, this is what they typed.
Okay.
They said scapula.
Okay, I got this.
I know they meant scapular. But they said, okay, if it's been blessed, if it's been blessed and it accidentally gets washed, does it need to be blessed again? Like, did you wash the blessing off of it?
I don't think it's like a spray-on blessing, and so I think you're good. The object itself has become blessed, and so if you wash it or something like that, no, it's fine. I think sometimes people, so if something sacred were desecrated or blasphemed, like a sacred space or a church, you would reconsecrate it. You would do a reconsecration of the space. And so I suppose if your scapular were intentionally taken by someone for a bad purpose and used in that way, you might want to re-bless it or reconsecrate it. But typically, simple things like washing it or things like that, you wouldn't need to worry about.
Okay. Good deal. Okay, so here's our last question here. Can you receive communion more than once a day? And if not, why?
I think this is a fantastic question.
Yeah,
so, interestingly, the canon law does allow for you to receive the Eucharist twice in one day. You can attend Mass as many times as you want, but you can only receive Eucharist twice in one day, and ordinarily it'd only be one time. Twice would be sort of an exception. So you have, let's say, a funeral earlier in the day, and you go to that and you receive communion, and then you go to the Vigil Mass that night or something like that. You'd be able to receive maybe twice. Of course, exceptions are for priests who would receive at every Mass they celebrate. I think even altar servers would be permitted to do that. Don't quote me on that, but I think that'd be permitted. But so the reason this law exists in our canon is because there's been abuses in history where there was really this misunderstanding of the sacrifice of the Mass and how he participated in it, that the primary purpose was to receive communion. And of course, the primary purpose of Mass is not actually to receive communion, though it's a very important part. The primary thing of the Mass is to offer the sacrifice of Christ, to pray in union with him and with the church, to offer Christ's sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving to the Father. And so there was a period in the church's history where people, so you know how like today we do concelebration, that was not the norm a time ago, and you'd have all these little side altars, and so you'd have multiple Masses sort of happening at different times or starting at different times around one big church. So what happens, people would go from like one side altar to the next during communion time and receive communion at all like 12 of them or something like that. And they would think, if I receive more Eucharist, if I receive more communion, then I receive more grace. And it was this misunderstanding of like, if I receive it more, then I have more grace. And yet the understanding is that when we receive Christ in the Eucharist, we receive the fullness of him, and we're not lacking in any grace that he wants to give. And so the receiving of communion more times does not mean that you've received more grace. And you take Christ into yourself, and so Christ remains with you when you receive the Eucharist in this way. And so this law was put in place to restrict receiving communion excessively and that sort of abuse of the liturgy. And so that's why there's a limitation on it. The other was true, that we had to create a law to make sure people receive communion, because an alternate abuse was that people thought, we're not holy enough to receive the sacraments, and so people wouldn't receive. And there was this whole period of time in the church that people would not ordinarily receive the sacraments at Mass. And eventually the church put the law in place saying at least once a year you have to receive the Eucharist. At least once a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, I didn't know about that one. I knew about this one. Well, I knew about this one when we were missionaries. We had to get, I guess it was a dispensation then from the bishop, because what we were doing is we were taking communion to having communion services at these very, very remote villages in northern Mexico. And he said, because we knew about this, and so we're like, we can only receive twice. But then that meant at the third service, we're not receiving communion. And the bishop of that diocese did not like the idea of missionaries coming in and telling people, hey, you need to receive communion, it's very important, and then we're not even doing it. And he didn't like that witness.
And I think that's generally it's generally permissible when you're ministering in that way, to be receiving the Eucharist. I think that's something that hasn't, to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert, been addressed in canon law. It's 1983.
I think that's why he dispensed it, because he's like, well, here.
And so the bishop can dispense with some things. There's some law that the bishop is unable to dispense with, but he does have the rights to dispense with local law and things like that.
So cool. All right, everyone. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you have a question that you've always wanted to know about the faith, or about, anything regarding Catholicism or Bible translations, who knows what your question might be, you can submit your question to podcast@txstatecatholic.org. Send that our way, and we'll get to it at the next episode. Or maybe we'll just talk about perfect hair and perfect teeth again, because, imagine being Father Craig and having both.
Or Father Mike Schmitz. He's got us all beat.
He does. Because he's also got a really good beard. Although you do too. But
Thank
his
you.
is
but
like...
his is manicured. No, that's not the right word. Manicured. Pedicured? No. Those are hands
manicured
and feet.
with an emphasis on man.
Yeah, there we go. Manicured. That's correct. That is correct, Brianne.
So, all right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening.
Yes, absolutely. Ask me sometime about Father Mike Schmitz and how I embarrassed myself in front of him. I'll tell you all about it.
All right, y'all hear that? You gotta ask him. Hear that story.
Our Lady of Wisdom,
pray for us.